In his name that we pray. Amen. All right, so as we said a couple of weeks ago, we emphasized that a large part of the Sermon on the Mount is a contrast with the world around us, that Jesus wants us to be different. Do not be like them. He wants us to be countercultural. The culture around us says, do this, be like this, act in this particular way. Christianity, the kingdom of heaven, calls us to look different, to be different, to act different, to speak differently, to have different attitudes, to be countercultural in that way, and to be different, to not be like them. Namely, especially in chapter 5, verse number 20, that Jesus said that we are to have a righteousness that exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. Not only are we to not be like the world in the way that we think of worldly people, blatantly sinful people, but we're also to not be like pseudo-spiritual people, people that have a spirituality that is on the outside, but inwardly their hearts are not truly in it. And so Jesus, in this call to be part of the kingdom, is hoping and pleading with his listeners, both in that day and to you and I today, that we would all have this type of attitude and this type of mindset, that is to say, that our hearts would be fully invested in this. And so in chapter number 6, last week John went through this section and it emphasized that there are at least 3 different areas that you can see this in the acts of righteousness or almsgiving or the fasting or the praying that people do. Oftentimes it's an outward show, but the inward reality is completely different. And as you continue into Matthew chapter 7, what we're going to see this morning is that the pleas from Jesus continue. In Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, we have a call to righteous judgment. A call to righteous judgment. This is one of perhaps the most favorite verses of the world around us when they look at a Christian and say, you ought not to judge me, Christian, because look what your Bible says. Here's what Jesus says. He says, judge not, that you be not judged. But what Jesus is not doing is he is not prohibiting all forms of judgment. In fact, just a little bit later in verse number 24, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who builds his house on a rock. And so there is, number one, a call to make a judgment about things in general, about your decision, about your behavior, and also that there is reason to believe that that you can see the difference between someone who is building their house on the rock and building their house on the sand. And so we'll get to that section a little bit more here in just a little bit. But again, he's not prohibiting all forms of judgment. You think about also in another place, it says that we ought to judge righteous judgment. But then also on top of that, to not prohibit evaluation, it's not prohibiting evaluation of doctrine. As you look also in Matthew chapter 7, verses 14 and 15, that you see, because narrow is the gate and difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it. But beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. Again, there's this distinction. There's this divide between what's on the outside and what's on the inside. And Jesus is not prohibiting evaluation of doctrine. In fact, he wants us to do that, to see and to be discerning about what's true. So again, he's not prohibiting evaluation of doctrine. In fact, don't believe everything that you hear is what Jesus wants you to know and to think. Consider also that he's not prohibiting evaluation of people's actions. In Ephesians chapter 5, verse number 11, Paul says, take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. Expose them. Not in a mean-spirited, vindictive, ugly way, but rather that in order that it might be clear that there is a distinction between the unfruitful works of darkness and the works of light, the works of righteousness. It's going to require that there be an exposure of that and that we can make that judgment between those two things. And so judgment certainly is not in and of itself wrong. In fact, in a number of places through the New Testament, it calls us to do this even within the church. Even among ourselves, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse number 6, that we would find that there is an expectation even to keep away from any brother who is walking in idleness and not in accord with the tradition that you received from us. And so even a discerning judgmental approach needs to be taken in order to say, this brother is walking waywardly. This sister is not walking in step with the words of God. This brother or sister is off of the straight and narrow, and therefore we need to discipline them according to the way that Scripture wants us to do so. Again, not mean-spirited, not vindictively, but in interest of their souls. And so what Jesus does mean, he is prohibiting hypocritical and hypercritical judgment. As you see in verses 3 through 5, the great account that we're likely all familiar with of don't look at the speck in your brother's eye when you've got a huge plank, a huge 2x4 sticking out of your own eye. What Jesus is condemning, what Jesus is expecting that we recognize is that there is such a thing as hypocritical and hypercritical judgment. And again, this connects back to the whole emphasis of this sermon, which is to say, yes, the Pharisees look spiritual on the outside, but inwardly they were ravenous wolves. They were like a whitewashed tomb. They were like a cup that was cleaned on the outside, but dirty on the inside. And hypocritical judgment is that. It looks from the outside and says, that's wrong. What you're doing is wrong, and I'm judging you for that, when all along on the inside, you might have the very same problem or perhaps an even more heinous problem. I was thinking this morning as I was washing. Last night I was frustrated with Emmy because you're 7 years old. Why are you still getting soap in your eyes when you're in the shower? I need a towel, Daddy. And this morning, lo and behold, while I'm showering, get a little soap in my eye, right? The judgment with which we will judge others is the judgment that we will receive, and that's ultimately the point. That Jesus wants us to understand, verse number 2, with what judgment you judge, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. Not only among ourselves here and now in this day and age in our lifetime. You can get on the internet and find that there are people who just love to find out that a preacher or some sort of ministry leader has sinned because they have been frustrated all along by the fact that this preacher or whatever might be calling out various sin, and then they find out that this person's being sinful themselves behind closed doors, okay, and they jump all over it, right? So the point is being careful with how we judge and even how we preach about things and how we teach about things, not forsaking or compromising the truth, but being careful that we recognize with humility as preachers and teachers of the truth that the same judgment with which we will judge, that we judge others, is the same way that we'll be judged by the world around us, but even more importantly, the mercy that we don't extend towards other people, the grace that we do not show towards other people in this life when they've wronged us, when they've hurt us, when they've hurt people that we love, is the same mercy and grace that will be absent from our judgment on the day of judgment that comes in the future. And so, be better than the Pharisees, be better than the Jewish leaders in the way that you judge. There's a call to righteous judgment. There's also a call to careful discernment. It's an interesting verse that is sometimes a head scratcher as you look at it. Do not give what is holy to the dogs, nor cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn and tear you in pieces. Strictly for time's sake, we just don't have enough time to really dig in as deeply as we could to this. But Jesus is ultimately commanding his followers not to share, not to give over the as some have called it, the richest part of spiritual truth with those who are always being spiteful and defiant against the truth, and they're unappreciative of truth in general. There are some people who simply just all they want to do is mock it. There's some people that simply don't want anything to do with it. All they want to do is make fun of it. Their hearts, their minds are already made up about it. And Jesus is calling us to being discerning about what you give over to these individuals, not because the truth isn't admonition that sometimes, as Jesus and others say in other places, that we ought to to shake the dust off of our feet with some individuals. And so a call to careful discernment. But then we see in verses 7 through 11 a call to confident trust. A call to confident trust. Notice in this particular section that there are 3 specific commands that maybe we overlook. Ask, and it will be given to you, number 1. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be opened. There is, as you continue on, this indication from Jesus that if we are persistent, as Jesus in another place talks about the importunate widow who constantly and persistently went to the judge asking for justice and vindication, that eventually the judge gave over to her plea. In a very similar way, as you see here, when we ask, when we seek, when we knock, as Jesus goes on to say, what man is there among you who, if his son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will he give him a serpent? If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father, excuse me, I told Joe this morning that the pollen was falling on our driveway, and got it all cleaned up yesterday, and about an hour later it was already completely covered up again. You couldn't even see the driveway anymore. Give it another week, a month or so before you can even power wash it. All right, continuing on. As you think about, if you then, being evil, verse number 11, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? Jesus gives a powerful and makes a powerful point here. It's not that Jesus is saying that you're going to be promised that if you just ask and ask and ask and ask for $1 million, that God is going to grant you that particular wish. I was wondering if I was going in and out.
Yeah, we changed the frequency last week, and it appears that yours is still not away from what we need it to be.
It's all good. All right, you can hear me now? Okay. It's not that Jesus is promising that if we just ask and ask and ask again, as we said a moment ago, for $1 million, that God is going to grant us that particular wish, but specifically that he will give us the things that we need. There is something to be said in this section for a need to be a more prayerful people. That there is this special relationship that exists that develops when we are a prayerful people. We could spend a whole quarter talking about prayer and the need to recognize that prayer, yes, is this conversation, it is this communication from us to God, but as we understand, God knows those things. So the question often is, why do we even pray if God already knows those things? Well, there is also an element of it for us, that as we continue to emphasize this need to place trust upon God, that we constantly ask and we constantly seek and we constantly knock, that it is going to continue to help our relationship grow even more. All right, let's get to verse number 12, this call to a higher ethic. A call to a higher ethic. The golden rule. The golden rule. How we treat others is not to be determined by how we expect them to treat us or by how we think they should treat us, but by how we want them to treat us. I've often used the illustration that you can misapply the golden rule and say, well, I want I would like for Erin to take me fishing, so I'm going to take her fishing. That's not exactly maybe what she wants. She enjoys going with me sometimes, but she probably doesn't want to go as often as I would like to go. And so it's not necessarily specifically applying it in that way, but looking at it from the angle of, if I were her, if I were in her shoes, how would I want to be treated? I want to treat others the way that I want to be treated in that way. But what we see here, we have highlighted on the screen there this higher ethic. And the reason we say that is because some will point out, well, Jesus' teaching is not all that different than some other teachers throughout history. And they'll point out that Jewish Rabbi Hillel said, what is hateful to yourself, do not do to someone else. Or in the apocryphal book of Tobit, you find, what thou thyself hatest, to no man do. Confucius said, what you do not want done to yourself, do not do to others. Greek philosopher Epictetus, what you avoid suffering yourself, do not afflict on others. Greek king Neocles, do not do to others the things which make you angry when you experience them at the hands of other people. The Stoics also said, what you do not want done to you, do not do to anyone else. But Jesus says something different. Whatever you want men to do to you, do you even so also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. And I want us to emphasize first that connection to the law and the prophets, because we know that first part of the verse, sometimes as we paraphrase it, do unto others as you would have them do to you. Okay? But we leave out this latter half, which is to say, for this is the law and the prophets. The law and the prophets were not necessarily a bad thing. We may look at them and think them as negative because we could never fulfill them completely and because they were insufficient to save us. They were burdensome in a way. But remember that Jesus said that he came not to destroy them earlier. He came rather to fulfill them. So what exactly is this relation of the golden rule to the law and the prophets? It might be summed up in what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 22, verses 36 through 40, what he called the greatest command in the law, as well as the second. You shall love your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Do you see that? The connection to the law and the prophets here? This rephrasing of that, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, do to others what you want done to you, to communicate it in that way, but not only to others, other human beings, but also to God. Because as you think about that, consider the motivation behind the golden rule. Is it just so that I can manipulate others and get something out of them? No, absolutely not. In fact, that's more along the lines of the other teachers' ideas or mindsets, that I would at least be able to self-preserve. Don't do to others what you don't want done to you, so that you don't get inflicted upon you what you don't want done to you. But Jesus's is different. His ethic is about love, whereas the other teachers' rules are about self-interest and self-preservation. The others are motivated by a fear to preserve self, but Jesus's rule is selfless. Do to others what you want done, regardless of what you might receive in return or what may have already been done or not been done to you in the past. This is the motivation. The motivation is love, to provide service, to do for others what you want done to you. Again, not hoping for something in return, but simply because you are not like the rest of the world. You're all about the kingdom. You're all about God's glory. And so the motivation behind it is not, well, do this and it will be good for you in the end. It's going to get you a promotion. It's going to mean more money for you. It's going to preserve you physically instead of getting you in a fight with someone. No, it's about taking it to the next level, showing the same type of love for others that God has shown to us, which is the golden rule exemplified. The golden rule, if you want to know what it looks like Jesus on the cross. It looks like God emptying himself and doing for me what he would want done, want someone else to do for him. And so in return, I should practice the golden rule in these two ways. I should first love God the way that I would want to be loved if I had given myself for him with all of my heart, with all of my soul, with all of my mind, with all of my strength. Would you not want that from someone who you love dearly enough to give your life for? Think about maybe this parent to child type of relationship that you love when your children love you back. You don't do things for them simply because you just want them to love you back. You truly just love them because you love them. But you do hope, you would desire, you do enjoy, you do take pleasure in the fact when your children love you back that there is this understanding of all that you have done for them, of all that you have sacrificed for them. And when they communicate that back to you, it is the golden rule. But also that we would love our neighbor the way that I would want my neighbor to love me, at the very level that I love myself. But again, especially that we would tack on to this again, that we are loving, we are treating others this way, expecting nothing in return, because only then is it really true love, when we expect nothing in return. If we're expecting something in return, is it really love in the end? I would argue that it's not. It would be argued that it's actually selfishness disguised in selflessness. Oh, look at me, look at what I'm doing for you. And it seems like on the surface that you're doing this from a selfish vantage point, but really, that's from a selfless vantage point, but really you're doing it from a selfish vantage point. Consider the byproducts of the golden rule. The byproducts of the golden rule, there are a million different ways that you could apply the golden rule. There are a million different ways that the golden rule is beneficial. Consider just a few of these that are helpful in this way. Number one, you could argue that it is something that addresses the sin problem. An amazing thing about the golden rule is that it is a recipe for sin avoidance. It is a great approach to avoiding sin. When I love God the way that I would want to be loved if I had given my life for him, I stop being concerned about self. I stop being concerned about what I want, and I start living for him. If I treat God the way that I would want to be treated, if I had done for God what he has done for me, my life is radically changed. The things that I'm concerned with and think about are radically different. And in the process, I rid myself of selfishness and sin begins to disappear. Because what's at the root of sin ultimately is, in many ways, selfishness. What do I want? I give into my desires, James chapter 1. And that's where sin conceives and gives forth birth. When I love my neighbor the way that I would want them to love me. When I love them as I love myself, I again stop being concerned about self and start being concerned about others. It's ultimately this antidote, selfless love is. Because sin is rooted, again, in selfish desires. As it addresses the sin problem, it also addresses the world's problems at large. If it starts with sin in my life and other people are affected by that, and they too then in turn are the snowball effect that they begin to see how the golden rule works, it addresses the world's problems. Not only does it keep the peace, but it makes peace. It's a peacemaker in a place where peace did not exist before. Our nation, as you are well aware, is so divided. And some people say it needs to be healed, or whatever phrase you want to use. It doesn't start, though, with a candidate. It starts with me, and it starts with you practicing the golden rule. It's called the golden rule for a reason, because only then will peace be made instead of kept. We're concerned about, well, which candidate will at least keep the peace more, which will at least keep them out of our lives, or whatever it may be, what you want from a candidate. The golden rule, if we'll just all practice this, ultimately makes peace. It starts and can only be accomplished by God's people showing true, genuine love to others. Marriages that are hanging on by a thread can only be healed through true, genuine love. Demonstrated in the practice of the golden rule. Again, applied in a million different ways to your spouse, to friendships that have reached an impasse that can't be reunited. They can be reunited by this humble approach to practicing the golden rule. Wars and fightings will cease when we stop being selfish, when we start loving others the way that we want to be loved and treated. Poverty and hunger will vanish away. We think about all the programs and the approaches of what we try to do to solve world hunger and water problems or whatever it may be. If everyone in the world just practiced the golden rule and looked to the people around them that were truly in need, it would solve it. But instead, because there is so much greed and selfishness in the world, there's often back doors and alternate routes that are taken to try to deal with these situations. But think about what it would solve if we would all practice the golden rule. But here's the difficulty of the golden rule. The difficulty of the golden rule is that, again, it is countercultural. It is completely opposite to. It completely goes against the grain of what the world says, of what culture around us says. Our culture says, you do you. Our culture says, do what makes you happy. Disney movies tell our children this. Be you. Do what makes you happy. Do what's best for you. Our Hallmark movies tell this to us. Sports world tells this to us. The business world tells this to us. We're told that no one is going to look out for you, that you need to fight tooth and nail and claw your way to the top, to look out for yourself. And you might even add on to that that's kind of our natural inclination at times, even from a very young age. Children stealing toys from other children. That we have a desire to want what we want. And so it requires an ever-conscious effort to root out that mindset, to tune it to the right settings, if you will, to constantly be calibrating our mind to be like the mind of Christ, to practice the golden rule, for in this and on this hangs the law and the prophets, that we would love our God with our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love our neighbor as ourselves. And so in the time we have remaining, there is a final call to action. A final call to action. On the heels of the golden rule is this plea from Jesus to make a choice. You know, Jesus gave an invitation at the end of his sermon here, the Sermon on the Mount. Sometimes we think, well, what's the need for an invitation? Jesus did it. He here wants people to hear what he said and to make a decision about it. Your choice, he has set before them, is to continue being like the world around you, whether they be like the Pharisees or whether they be like the Gentiles. Your choice is to be like them, or it is to follow the ways of the kingdom of heaven. And so he says in verses 13 and 14, choose wisely the path that you take. There are two ways, two gates, two crowds, and two destinations. Enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction. And there are many who go in by it. But narrow, because narrow is the gate, and difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are few that find it. You see the two options there. There are two ways, two gates, two crowds, and two destinations. Only one of those decisions is profitable. Only one of those is the right path to choose. And Jesus is inviting his listeners to make that decision, to follow after, and to do what he says. But then you see in verses 15 through 20, not only are we to choose wisely the path that we take, but that we would also choose wisely who we listen to, that we would not allow ourselves to be deceived. Read with me verses 15 through 20. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Again, going back to that judgment thing we talked about earlier. How do you know someone's fruit lest you judge it? You look at it, you examine it. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Even so, every good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits you will know them. And so Jesus says, you're going to hear some things that other people around today, they're going to say things about me. They're going to say things about my teachings. They're going to say things, they're going to make accusations and allegations about me. And that's exactly where it leads, that Jesus ends up on the cross because of a dislike and a disdain for what he taught and what he was calling them to do. But Jesus says, by their fruits you will know them. Compare what I'm teaching you today and where it will lead, the path that it will lead down, the road that it goes down, and the gate it leads to. Compare that. Examine the fruit there compared to the fruit that comes from those individuals. Those individuals, as we said earlier, were those who they were like whitewashed tombs. They had the outside of the cup clean, but inwardly it was dirty. And Jesus says, look at the two and compare them. You make the choice. It's your choice, Jesus says. I'm inviting you to make this choice. Determine for yourself if you want to follow in the kingdom, if you want to go down this path. So choose wisely who you listen to. But then in verses 21 through 23, choose wisely what you claim. Choose wisely what you claim. There are two claims that we'll see in verses 21 through 23. One says it, and one does it. There's one who says he's done it but hasn't, and the one who says he has done it and actually has. Jesus says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonders in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. And so choose wisely what you claim. This isn't just about what you're claiming, though. It's now turning the previous section inward. Choose wisely who you listen to and examine their fruit. Examine what's coming from their life. And here Jesus is saying, choose wisely what you claim, because you need to examine your own life. You need to examine inwardly what fruit you are producing. Are you producing the fruit of the Pharisees, or are you producing fruit akin to the Christ? Comparing those two will help us in determining whether or not we are in accord with and consistent with the teachings and the lifestyle of the kingdom. And then ultimately, in verses 24 through 27, choose wisely what you do with what you hear. This is, again, just a reestablishment, a re-emphasis of this invitation. He's inviting us to make a decision about the way. Which way are you going to go down? He's inviting them to make a decision about who they listen to. It's your choice. Are you going to listen to the Pharisees or the people of the world, or are you going to listen to me? It's your choice what you claim. But here, he says, choose wisely what you do with what you hear. Let's read these verses. Verse 24. Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house. And it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. But everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew, and they beat on that house, and it fell. And great was its fall. What you'll see here in this section, there are two builders, and there are two foundations, you would say, and 2 results. 2 builders, 2 foundations, and 2 results. One man is wise. One who looks at the situation, who examines the ways, who examines the fruits, who makes the claim and actually does what he says he's doing, and he builds on the foundation of what Jesus is teaching. It's important to have a good solid base from anything that we're building. Jackson was having someone help him with his baseball swing the other day, and what we think is an important swing is all in the arms, but no, I don't know. I was a football, basketball guy. I'm listening to him, and he's saying, no, it starts with your legs. It starts with your base and twisting your hips. Everything in life starts with an important understanding of our foundation being the preeminent and most important part of what we're doing. And the question is, for us, as we consider this invitation from Jesus, is what foundation are we building on? Are we building on the shifting things of this world? So often our lives, what we're all about, is built on the shifting sands of money, the shifting sands of prominence and fame and notoriety, the shifting sands of pleasure and enjoyment, these things that seem to be that which would bring us what we would desire. In this case, someone who's building on this sand, well, not only is it easier, but I can get it done and it gives me what I need. But if we build on those things, it leads to ultimately destruction. 2 results. One withstands the tests and the difficulties of life. The other, when the winds come and the rain comes and the flood comes, as we sing in our VBS song, the foolish man's house went splat. The foolish man's house went splat. And so the question for us this morning is, which of the 2 ways, which of the 2 fruits, which of the 2 claims, which of the 2 foundations are you building on? Which am I building on? Which is most evident in our life? What fruit is being produced? What can we see as evidence that is showing us what we are building upon? Because ultimately this life is but a vapor. We're just passing through. This world is not our home. And if we're just building on those shifting sands, it's going to be meaningless. It's going to be worthless. It's going to be pointless in the end. As the preacher says in Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And his conclusion in the end is, this is the whole duty of man, to fear God and to keep his commandments, which connects very appropriately and beautifully back to what Jesus is saying, that everything that we're about, everything in this life is about, again, the law and the prophets. What's the first and most important command, and the second like unto it? We would love our God with our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and that we would love our neighbor as ourselves. In the couple of minutes that we have remaining, look at the end, verses 28 and 29. And so it was, when Jesus had ended these sayings, that the people were astonished at his teaching. For he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. They were astonished because Jesus' teaching was different. Again, that is evidence of, going back to the previous section we considered a moment ago, of comparing their fruits. What was Jesus known for? In the chapters leading up to the Sermon on the Mount, go back to chapter number 4. Remember what he was doing? He was going around having compassion on people and healing them of their diseases and doing for them, practicing the golden rule. Not only did he practice the golden rule on the cross, but he practiced the golden rule in his day-to-day life, the way that he interacted with people, how he treated others. And so they see this man and his fruit and the way that he's teaching, and they realize not only is Jesus teaching these things, but he's living these things. And that was completely different than what they were used to with the scribes and the Pharisees. The scribes and the Pharisees, again, whitewashed tombs, dirty cup on the outside, on the inside, but clean on the outside. But Jesus, he was one that was teaching with authority. He was one who was teaching differently than the scribes. And the emphasis here is that they recognized, they saw, they beheld with their own eyes that what Jesus was teaching was different. It was distinct. It was unlike anything else that they'd ever heard. Again, going back to things like the Golden Rule, in which there were similar teachings, there were similar statements that were being made by teachers of the day and even before Jesus, but Jesus was a higher ethic. Go back to chapter number 5, verses 20 through the end of the chapter, and how Jesus says, "You've heard it said, but I say to you." Again, that's another re-emphasis of a higher ethic. That is to say, it's one thing for you to not murder your brother. Well, that's all well and good. Yeah, don't murder your brother. But someone who has hatred in his heart, it's basically like he's already murdered him. Or, yeah, it's great that you haven't committed adultery. It's great that you haven't cheated on your spouse. And you've heard other people say that, but I say to you, Jesus says, someone who looks at a woman to lust after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And so time and time again throughout this sermon, perhaps as it's often been coined, the greatest sermon of all time, Jesus shows that his teaching was transcendent. It was above all else. They were astonished because he taught with authority. He taught because he knew the truth, yes, but he also lived the truth. May we be like our God, and may we follow after that invitation. May we be like Christ in the way that he taught and lived it out as well. Thanks for your attention this morning.